It's Greg Nicotero, Nicotero. I'm the showrunner, executive producer, director, and special effects makeup artist.
Yeah, dope.
I guess. Yeah.
So, if no one minds, I got a question right off the bat. So, you've got a franchise like Creepshow, very long-standing fan base, and we've seen a lot of horror franchises kind of get reborn lately. And there's this old expectation from the old fans versus the newer fan base in horror, newer realities, expectations of modern horror, newer social zeitgeist, if you will. How do you manage as the showrunner to please both fan bases?
Well, it's easy because the stories are great. I mean, the original Creepshow was Steve and George's love letter to EC Comics. So they were just paying tribute to something that they loved, something that inspired them. And of course, Creepshow was something that inspired me. So I feel like it's not a reboot, it's not a rebranding. I always felt that Creepshow was way ahead of its time in terms of the way that George told those stories. So it will satisfy fans of the original because it's going to feel like, oh, well, I just read that issue, now I'm going to read another issue. And I think with newer audiences, the idea that this anthology, it's unlike anything else because we can tell whatever stories we want. Some of them are kind of funny and, some are weird and some are scary. There's a story that a guy named Chris Buellman wrote called Man in the Suitcase, and it's about this stoner dude that brings a suitcase home from the airport and he opens it and there's a guy in it and he's stuck and he's like, help me out, and he's like, whoa, what the fuck, man? You're like, and when he tries to get him out, like gold coins shoot out of his mouth and he's like, I'm gonna be rich, like I can just torture this guy in this suitcase and gold coins shoot out of his mouth. And it's the weirdest story, but it's so funny and it's so odd, and that's kind of what was fun about like EC Comics stuff, and so I really wanted to embrace the idea that these stories can be outrageous and scary and weird all at the same time. So I really, and by the way, knowing what a giant nerd I am, like the Easter eggs and the little things that I put in the show I do it on Walking Dead all the time, and nobody knows it until I talk about it, because I was like, oh yeah. In the first episode of Walking Dead, there's like a giant Jaws reference, which nobody on set knew. I knew. My set deck guys know. But, it's just being able to exhibit that kind of fun, like, this is why I love this genre. This is why it's so much fun. So I think that people are going to be really pleasantly surprised, the fans of the original.
What is that process like of choosing the stories and seeing what new to be told as opposed to recreating what's been done?
Well, that's a great question because, I started reading a lot of short horror fiction, and when you're producing 3 TV shows and you're direct, I don't have a lot of time to read books. Like, I love reading, but I just don't have time, so I need the appetizer version. And so, Dave Scow wrote a story called The Finger that John Carpenter published in one of his comic books, and I loved it. And I know a lot of great writers and a lot of there are a lot of friends. So the idea that we would start collecting material, and like Josh Mallerman sent like 5 short stories, and they were all great. And I was like, well, which ones do we make? Because they're all so fucking good. But what was interesting about it was, like, there was one that we really, really liked, and we might make it for if we do a season 2. But you have to balance that, like, is it feels a little Twilight Zone-y versus, I wanted them to really feel like straight horror, at least in terms of the tone. But that was the fun part, was like working on Walking Dead and going to bed with like stacks of like stories to read and scripts to read.
So Giancarlo had mentioned that in his episode there's a really scary creature.
Yes.
That freaked him out. Can you talk about how you went about designing these creatures?
Well, listen, I mean, I was super grateful to everybody that agreed to come on board. I'll get to your question in a minute, but so as soon as Creepshow was greenlit, I reached out to Steve King and said, "Listen, it's not Creepshow without you and without a story from you." So he was like, "Great," and so he gave me 2 stories, but the one that we ended up shooting was Gray Matter, and that was a situation where I kind of picked up my phone and called my friends. I was like, "Giancarlo, hey, do you want to come spend 3.5 of the longest days of your life shooting with me?" And he was in, and Tobin was in, and Adrian was in, and like that was kind of, and Stephen King. So, but for that particular episode, Gray Matter, the Stephen King story is about this guy who kind of turns into this. It's really a story about alcoholism and codependence in the Stephen King world, where his son doesn't know what to do because his dad is drinking himself. But in our world, he turns into a creature as opposed to getting help. And we designed a couple of these really crazy creature suits and covered it in slime, and it's got a little Jordy Verrill vibe to it, in terms of the way the set was built, and that was done intentionally. But we had a creature every episode. I mean, we really embraced the practical nature of it, because that's what a comic book series would require, would be practical effects. So my shop was running full steam ahead, building all the creatures and stuff for the show.
Jumping off that, kind of, you mentioned about the alcoholism analogy and kind of and what the story's about, and we were talking to Giancarlo about the analogous nature of horror and how it can be used as social commentary, and you mentioned the Twilight Zone, and obviously George is like a trailblazer of that. Yeah. So kind of like, what's that legacy been like as well, kind of like making sure you're telling these really scary stories and thinking about how horror has always been a great place to talk about like the wider stories.
Yeah, and there's the episode that Trisha's in is very interesting, because it talks about it's about women in the workplace and how they treat each other, and there's a really fascinating dynamic there. So some of the stories do talk about that, and there's one called House of the Head that Josh Mallerman wrote that's about this sort of isolated little girl and how she played by Kaylee Fleming from Walking Dead, and how she sort of projects her loneliness into this dollhouse with these dolls. So there's a lot of that in it. I mean, George always was very aware of the social relevance of the stories that he was telling. So there's definitely a lot of that. But that's what great writing is. Great writing knows how to weave a great tale and put some relevance in there without being preachy, which is what's great.
So I got a kind of a fun question. As someone who obviously has a lot of love for the genre, are there any other classic franchises that you would like to get your hands on?
Oh, well, shit. I don't know. I've been so ensconced in these two worlds for the last 10 years, but I don't know. I mean, I always loved Prince of Darkness, John Carpenter movie, and I've been talking to people about remaking that, because there's such a great, the idea that, there was this church and there was these guys and there was this fucking Satan, and all of a sudden it's very, everything was out of balance, and it has that sort of Italian horror movie feel of like Seven Doors of Death, where the priest committed suicide and now the doors are open. I love that shit. I always love that sort of thin veil between what we believe is reality and what isn't. I've always had a lot of fun with that. So we've been talking about that for a little bit. But for Creepshow, the crazy thing is it was the first movie set I ever visited. When I was 16 years old, my uncle was an actor in Pittsburgh, and he was in the Crazies. So I happened to run into George Romero. We were on a family vacation, and I went, "Hey, my Uncle Sam was in the Crazies," and he was like, "Oh, yeah, great, hi." And I was 15 at the time, and they were starting to shoot Creepshow, and he invited me to come visit. And it was a half hour from my house.
Yeah.
So I literally drove my car, and I pull up in the parking lot, and there's like a gymnasium and like an old school, abandoned school. And I was like, this doesn't look like a movie. I imagine what a movie studio would look like. But I walked into the gymnasium, and there was all these flats, you know, like movie flats, and like wood struts, and guys banging hammers and stuff. And I remember I didn't know where to go. I was just going to, I was a kid. And I turned a corner and I walked in, and I was on the university set from The Crate with the steps where the creature was under. And I'll never forget the feeling of going from one world to another. Like, I walked into the set and I turned around and I was transported. And I was like, holy fuck, like, you can get a job and do that. Like, you can, you know, build sets, and you can. And it was such a fascinating experience that I visited a lot. And George and his wife at the time were like, "Hey, do you want a job?" And I'm like, "But I'm only a kid. Like, I don't know. So I turned down a job on Creepshow as a production assistant because I felt, what the fuck did I know? But my dad was also like, well, you're the smart one in the family, and you're going to be the doctor. And I'm like, okay. And then Day of the Dead comes up, and George is like, hey, do you want a job? I'm like, yes. And that's how it happened, because we developed that friendship on the set of Creepshow because I would go visit. And the idea that, and Savini, Tom talks about it a lot, that he found Hollywood in his backyard. He didn't have to move to Los Angeles to become part of this filmmaking community because George had this community around him. And I feel like I'm paying it forward because I hired Tom Savini and I hired John Harrison, who wrote the music. John Harrison was the first AD on Creepshow, and I hired him to write and direct. And I hired Rick Catazone, who did the animation. And I feel like, just like George, who had this group of people that he used on all of his movies, it's like I feel like now that's my opportunity. So in terms of it being as authentic as it can be, I feel like I have an obligation to George. And his daughter Tina came and visited the set, and she was like, your dad would be so proud of you right now. And there was a lot of times when I felt him and his presence, and like I turn around and I look, and there's Tom Savini and John Harrison, and I was like, you guys were there when they did this for real, and now we're here again. So that makes me super proud, really proud.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.